Hi everyone, in this video I'm building an ITX case with an epoxy resin artwork for the side panel. Before I just YOLO it and waste a bunch of resin, I thought I would be very scientific and test out 3 different methods at small scale before attempting the actual project. For the first test, I made the mold higher thinking I'll pour a clear layer over the colored parts, which gave it a slightly rippled surface, making it look a bit more like stained glass. I also used a thin layer of clear epoxy to glue the mold to some wax paper, and it worked on this small scale, but more on that later. For the second test, I glued the mold to an acrylic sheet because I wasn't sure how strong the end result would be. This actually also worked to seal off each section while pouring. For the third test, I wanted to see what happens if I painted the mold before adding the epoxy resin, thinking it may not stick to the paint, but it did actually. In all 3 tests, the back looked horrible, so keep that in mind if you're building something that will be visible from all angles. But in this case, it's the side panel of a PC, so only the front will be seen. Turned out the resin was strong enough that I didn't need the acrylic, but you might want to use that method with thinner acrylic to avoid epoxy seeping out between the sections. There's also another method I saw on YouTube where you use resin tape to seal the back of the mold. It looks like it works much better than any of the methods I tried actually. I'll add a link to the STL I used for this project in the description. I had to be very careful sanding the mold. It's very flimsy and could break easily. I use a filler primer to fill the small gaps and then I painted it black. You can use a spray can, but I like using the airbrush since it works out a bit cheaper in the long run and I have less dripping and pools of paint when I have to get into nooks and crannies. So I gave it 3 layers of acrylic black paint. You can use cheap craft paint as long as you thin it properly, and I used some acrylic varnish to protect it. I tried to coat the back of the mold with epoxy to create a seal, but as you will see, it didn't work very well. I think I may have moved it around too much and some of the sections came loose from the wax paper, so I had to do some emergency patching with UV epoxy to prevent it from leaking too much into the other sections. This turned into quite a mess and I thought it was a write-off, but after the epoxy cured, it didn't look that bad. I didn't realize the pigment I used was metallic and it didn't create solid colors. It seems to be aimed at jewelry making, not to create a cartoon picture that needs flat colors. I'm building the case out of 12mm thick pine and Tasmanian oak. All the timber is dressed or S4S, but I'm still milling it again to get rid of some bowing. I'm using the Tasmanian oak to make it look a bit more interesting and also to get boards that are wide enough. You'll notice I accidentally made 2 side panels even though I only needed 1, but it will actually come in handy later on as a reference surface when I do the construction, and I might be able to turn it into something useful later, like a serving platter. I 3D printed the back of the case. I had some large uneven bits that I filled with multi-purpose filler, and as usual I used filler primer and acrylic paint. I should have glued these sections together and filled the glue seams before painting them, but this will be the back of the PC and it will face the wall, so it won't be visible. I made a small router template for the front I/O hole, and I used a spiral bit and bushing to remove the material in 2 passes. Then I added a small round over, since you will be plugging in USB sticks and pressing the power button. You don't want sharp edges, and it will also create a bit more clearance. The downside of round overs in pine is all the sanding. It could also be my bits are dull or not very good quality. I'm adding 220mm fans to the front, and there's an exit vent in the back of the PC above the I/O shield. This PC will use an AMD APU and no dedicated GPU, and is based on a similar build I did earlier, so I know the cooling will be adequate. I'm adding threaded inserts for the fans. Since the wood is only 12mm thick, I don't think screwing the fans in from the inside with wood screws will work. You could make the screws visible and drill them from the front, which is a viable option and can look great, but I wanted to keep the front of this case as simple as possible. I also added some CA glue to the insert holes just to make sure they don't come out. The fence squares I usually use for assembly didn't fit inside the small case, so I used these ones with some double-sided tape, and it actually worked. Now usually it's better to only print the back side once you're done with the case so you can match them exactly. But to save time, I printed the back side before I built the case. So there was a small gap which I ended up filling with a tongue depressor stick. Once again, it's at the back of the case. It will be facing the wall so no one will see it. I prefer to screw in the back side so I can remove it again if need be, but you can also glue it in with epoxy. As you can see, the whole backside of the case was 3D printed, but I didn't glue it as tightly as I should have, and it was a bit flimsy. I think it might be better to make the back half height or low profile, and then I can add some wood to support it, especially since I already knew this case won't need a full-size GPU. If I ever had to add a GPU or Wi-Fi card, I can use low profile ones. I added some brackets for structural support, and they will also be used with magnets to hold the side panel in place. I had to cut some of them shorter since they were in the way of the fans. My kind of failed method of sealing the back of the mold with epoxy led to loads of cleanup work, so if you're going to do this, rather use resin tape to seal the mold. To create a rabbet for the mold, I could use the router table or table saw. I thought the table saw would be faster and cleaner, and my fingers will be further away from a spinning blade, but the downside is there will be a gap to fill afterwards. I added a small bevel to remove the sharp edges and prevent them getting damaged during use. I didn't use threaded inserts for the motherboard standoffs, since I don't foresee the motherboard being removed often, but I did add some CA glue to make sure the standoffs are secure. I also added some reinforcements to the USB ports, since you'll be pushing USB sticks and portable hard drives into them. I like to use beeswax for the finish, since you don't need protection for a PC case surface, but it makes the grain pop and you don't leave a film or nasty smells. I had to add the finish before I installed the fan mesh and I/O panel to avoid getting beeswax on them. The magnets are strong enough to keep the side panel from falling off, but it can still slide down, so I added a small stop underneath to prevent that. I tried gluing the magnets with CA glue, but some of them didn't touch the frame, so I used epoxy to glue those. It came out looking good. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you liked the video.